We're going to start with the slides from chapter 17. This is basically genetics. I'm going to start, this will be a series of videos based on the PowerPoints that come from the book. Here we're at genetics slides, part 1. There will be multiple editions of this, so look for part 2, part 3, part 4, etc. So let's move on here. The first thing you ought to know out of the book is we need to know some terms. Usually the way you should look at this is if it's in bold. Here, inheritance and particulate inheritance. You should know these things, but as a general rule, you should also know generally what's going on here. Now, I'm going to give you additional information in these PowerPoints beyond what comes with the PowerPoint lectures, in other words, what's in the book. So, for instance, let's go to inheritance. It's the acquisition of traits by their transmission from parents to offspring. And people have understood this for a long time. Everybody sees that parents are similar to their children, but not identical. It's kind of a mixing of the traits being things like hair color and eye color and height and weight. And they won't be like any one parent, but they'll have a few traits from one and a few traits from other, maybe even a few that are not in their parents that are a little different, or maybe they might see these traits from a grandparent or a great-grandparent even. But generally the idea is that inheritance, there are certain characteristics, certain things about your appearance, your behavior, what you can eat, what you can't eat, that sort of thing, that are inherited from the people who came before you, the people in your family that you might see similarities in that don't occur in other families, unless of course somebody breeds within the family. You have someone from one family marries someone else in another family and they have children, and that child will have a mixture of the traits that are common maybe in both families. So inheritance is the idea that these traits can be passed down from one generation to another, but it's a mixture of both parents, and it's important to realize that you do have two parents, and the traits do come from both parents. It's a mixture. You don't get all of dad, you don't get all of mom, you get a little bit of both, but not all of both. All right, so the idea is inheritance. So even in the 1700s, it was accepted that such a thing existed, and people began to think that there was something in, we call the genetic material of the two parents that blended together. They didn't know what this was. Eventually we called it genes, but we didn't know what a gene was. Realize we actually, as we're going to see here, came up with the idea of genes, and we were able to study genes without actually knowing that genes were related to the DNA. That came much later, and we're going to study about a guy named Mendel here, and Mendel had no idea DNA even existed. Nobody did at the time, but they were still able to come up with the laws of genetics just from observing what happened from when you bred certain animals or plants, and you look to see what the result was. We came up with certain laws, and you'll need to learn those laws. Now, the next guy I want to talk about here is, let's see here. Let's do this. Lamarck. Okay, now Lamarck, he's an interesting character. He had this weird idea that what you do in your life affects the nature of your children. So at the time, 1700s, people took him seriously, and he wrote books and things like that, and people believed a lot of the things he said. And then, of course, we came up with the laws of genetics and realized that, this guy, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Then we come up to the 21st century, and we learn about something called epigenetics, which we will talk about in here, and we realized, actually, some of the things Lamarck said are sort of true. Now, to give you an idea of how absurd, though, some of the things he said, he actually the classic example are giraffes. And in that it says that giraffes have long necks because they stretch their necks their entire lives, and this affects whatever is transmitted to the children so that the children have longer necks. Now this is not the way it works, of course. If it worked the way Lamarck said, then if you were to say be a bodybuilder, a weightlifter, your whole life, and you became really muscular, then basically your children would just be born like little Arnold Schwarzeneggers, right? They'd be these little muscular like babies or something. That's kind of the way Lamarck envisioned it, and it does not work that way. At least we didn't think it did. There are some things that we call it Lamarckian. There are some Lamarckian ideas that are correct once we began to study epigenetics. And what that means is what happened to your ancestors does affect your genes in your life, or how they operate in your life. You inherited your genes from your parents, and they inherited their genes, of course, from their parents. But how those genes are used is actually determined by what happened to your parents, or even more important, believe it or not, your grandparents. And this is called epigenetics, and we'll learn a little bit about this in here. It's really interesting, and it's something that if you'd gone back 20 years ago, say when I was in college even, and you had said that there were some Lamarckian ideas that were actually correct, you would have been laughed at. Nobody would have taken you seriously, and they would have thought you were a really foolish person to even consider it. It would be like believing in, I don't know, what would be something common? It'd be like believing in, I'm thinking like pyramid power, or if you don't know what that is, look it up. It's in the 70s. They thought if you put like razor blades in pyramid structures, that they wouldn't dull. They'd stay sharp because they were placed in a pyramid-shaped container. I don't think there's anything to that, and people didn't think there was anything to Lamarck, and actually laughed at people who did, until we came up with epigenetics. All right, now 19th century. We started looking at things at a microscopic level, using, of course, microscopes, and chromosomes we figured were the things that were actually passed down. Now, we didn't know what chromosomes were made out of. They're made of DNA and protein, but primarily DNA. That's the way we'll think of it. And it was thought that maybe the chromosomes were the thing that passed on those traits. They were the thing you inherited that made you like your parents, and that was pretty much correct. And then we have Mendel, and Mendel is the one who worked out the laws of genetics. It would come much later that we directly connected the genetics to the chromosomes, well, to the chromosomes here, and the genetics. Linking those two things came along much later, but Mendel came up with the laws, and then even before Mendel, though, we had kind of figured out that maybe the chromosomes were the thing. They weren't sure, but since they did seem to separate right before the cells divided, we kind of decided that that must be the thing, and they were correct. All right, so we need to learn some more terms. When we do genetics, we're going to have what we call simple Mendelian inheritance, and that's pretty much where it's the simplest version of it. And we need to learn some terms. You'll need to go through, and I'll make some more videos that talk about these terms in a lot more detail. I think you'll like the videos more than, I could make you memorize things in the book. I think you watch the videos before you start memorizing. You're going to need to memorize some things, but watch the videos. Autosome, allele, dominant and recessive. All right, if these things, traits, if these things are unfamiliar to you, you'll need to go back and review some various parts in the book. An allele is just a different version of the same gene. So what do I mean by that? Well, that means different people have different genes, but they're both genes for the same thing, like eye color. So there is a gene for eye color, but there's one version of it that might be for blue eyes, another for brown eyes, another for green eyes. Those would all be alleles. So the different versions of a gene are the alleles. Dominant and recessive, this is the concepts of some genes show up and some do not. A recessive gene is covered up, you might say, by a dominant gene. So you might realize everybody has 2 copies of every gene. You get one from mom, one from dad, and maybe dad's is recessive and mom's is dominant. If that's the case, then you get, most of the time, we'll see some exceptions, but in the most basic situation, if mom has the dominant gene, all right, right here, then if that's brown eyes, then you're going to have brown eyes. Dad may have had blue eyes, but since you had one dominant and one recessive, the one that shows up in you is the dominant one. We'll come to these later, but you're going to need to know a lot of terms, and I have some videos already made from other classes that go through a lot of these terms, and so I'll post those on YouTube along with this one, and you'll be able to watch and figure out what's important for the exams. Basically, if I talk about it on here, it's probably going to be on the exam. Now, on a molecular basis, read through this. Just realize there's some more terms like dominant homozygote. You're going to need to know that. And you're going to need to be able to link the idea, you also need this one, heterozygote. You're going to need to link proteins to genes, and I'll be talking about that later, but as you move through and you read it, you're going to need to understand how a gene leads to the production of a protein. And just learn it right here, right now. Remember this, don't forget it, that proteins do all of the, I shouldn't say all, I'm going to say 99.9% of the chemical and physical work in your body. So within a cell, there needs to be work, things to be moved around, chemicals that need to be altered and turned into other chemicals. All of that would be done by the proteins, all right? So the proteins are what do the work inside your cells and essentially allow you to do everything from walk around to think to everything. All the chemical and physical work are essentially done by proteins, and we'll learn how and why that happens later. But you need to understand that a gene, an individual gene, like a gene for hair color or eye color or something, is a protein. In other words, it isn't a protein, it's the information for making a protein. So genes are informations for making the things that make you who you are. And the things that make you who you are primarily the proteins. Not 100%, but really close. So that's why you change a gene, you change a protein, you change who that individual is or that organism. That organism makes a protein a little different, well then it's going to appear or act a little different. So X-linked, we'll realize that there are things called the sex chromosomes, and the sex chromosomes are X and Y. If you're female, you have 2 X's. If you're male, you have an X and a Y. And in this particular case, there are genes on these chromosomes. So chromosomes contain genes. You can think of a chromosome as just a bunch of DNA all wound up and kind of stuck together. Under the microscope, it looks kind of like I don't know, the wings off of a fly or something. You might look at it that way, but we'll look at some pictures. And but these are special chromosomes that determine your sex. And like I said, if you have 2 X's, you're female. If you have an X and a Y, you're male. And traits, in other words, genes that are on the X and Y chromosome are called sex-linked. And we'll talk about how that affects how things are transmitted from one generation to another, because if you're female, you only get the genes on the 2 X chromosomes. If you're male, you get X from your mom, but you get the Y from the dad, and that's the only way you can get those. And therefore, there are some genes that only men have, and there are some combinations of genes that only women have, and it makes a difference. Most of the physical characteristics are determined by, between men and women, are determined by the X and Y chromosome. Otherwise, we're all the same, at least male and female, but when you get different genes are on the different chromosomes, and in case of women, they get 2 copies of the genes they have on the X chromosome, whereas men just get 1 copy, and that is very important. We'll talk about that later. Let's see, molecular basis. Again, talking about, you need to know these terms, heterozygote, homozygote. We'll talk about that. I have videos on just that. Inheritance pattern, all right? Pattern, that means your phenotype. Just remember that phenotype is what you look like. So if you have brown hair, that's your phenotype. Your phenotype is brown hair or blue eyes. In other words, it's a fancy word for saying, well, that gene you have, how does it make you different? And so if the gene you have gives you blue eyes, then blue eyes are your phenotype that come from that gene. Now there's also genotype, and genotype will be a little different than phenotype. One is what your genes say, and then one is what you actually end up looking like, and they're not always the same. You should, I keep scrolling on that. You should know what wild type means. Wild type is essentially the most common gene. It's the one, if we took the version of it, remember we have different versions, blue eyes, brown eyes, we call those alleles. Well, the most common set of alleles create an organism that we call the wild type, or the wild type allele, or the most common. In other words, the one that's the standard. All right, now then we have inheritance pattern. I'm going to skip that for now. We will get to it. It has to do with blood groups and a particular type of genetics, and we have to talk a little bit more about it. But codominance kind of means that instead of having like a dominant and a recessive gene, it means that they both show up. So maybe A is for blue skin and B is for pink polka dots. Well, it's possible if you get A and B that you get blue skin and pink polka dots. All right, or you could just have 2 A's and have blue skin, or you could have 2 B's and just have pink polka dots. But if you got one of each, you would have both. That's codominance, more or less, and we'll use blood type as an example of how you get of how codominance works. Let's see, epistasis. This is that idea of one gene covering up another. We have a dominant that covers up a recessive, and whenever you have that situation, you say, oh, that's epistasis. All right, now we can go to the next one. This is Gregor Mendel. I'm not going to ask you a lot about him, and that's why you listen to these videos, because I tell you what I'm interested in and what I'm not. I'm interested in knowing who he is, know his name. He's the father of genetics, and he came up with all these laws. And so we're going to do these things called crosses and just realize he figured out how it all works. Now we know that this is much more complex, and we'll learn why it's much more complex. This is what I would call old school genetics. We learn that first because it's simple, it's straightforward. Got to do a little math with it, nothing hard, just a little percentages and some ratios. But we now know that even though everything Mendel said was correct, it's not the whole thing. And things like the thing I told about epigenetics, wow, there is so much more to learn today. But we'll start with the basics, which is Gregor Mendel's laws of inheritance. What did he study? Well, he studied garden peas, all right? You know, like they're very similar to English peas. And he bred them. So what do I want you to know about Gregor Mendel? I want you to know that he bred peas and came up with these laws. Now we need to know what a character is. A character is like eye color. Now a trait is going to be blue eyes if the character is eye color. So you can have multiple traits for the same character. So characters would be things like eye color, hair color, height, weight, and then the traits would be the individual versions of the characters that you got. So in other words, this is associated with a gene. All right, this one is associated with an allele. An allele is a version of a gene, just like a trait is a potential I don't want to say characteristic, a potential phenotype, a potential observable thing about you that has to do with the character. So the character is the generic one, though. The character is like eye color, hair color, how foot size. All right, and then here these are the precise versions of those things, like big feet, little feet, medium feet, brown hair, blue hair, etc. Those are the traits. And this is associated, remember this, with alleles. This is associated with what? A gene, essentially. So an allele is a different version of a generalized gene, a gene for hair color, and an allele would be the specific version of the gene that you inherited. Okay, this is generally, we're just looking at flowers here, so you'll need to look at this because we'll be doing some examples of what Mendel did. So what he did was he bred things like white flowers and purple flowers, and then looked to see what the offspring looked like. Did they come up with being half white and half purple? What exactly happened? He also looked at things like flower position, seed color, seed shape, pod color, pod shape, and height. We'll be doing examples of all of those. All right, now normally self-fertilizing. Okay, so it's kind of different with plants. Plants can more or less mate with themselves. I don't know any other way to say that. But a plant can often be both male and female at different times or even at the same time. And they can produce pollen, which will fertilize other plants, but also if this plant has female reproductive parts at the time, flowers, it could potentially fertilize itself. We call, like pollen, are called male gametes in the case of plants, but in, of course, animals, we would say sperm. Whereas in female plants, and female animals would be an egg, but we would call that an ovule in a plant. All right, so just know those things. Now, true breeding, we need to learn that term. True breeding means if you cross this organism with itself, you always get the same thing. All right, so a true breeding plant would be a plant that if you kept fertilizing it with its own pollen, then it would always produce plants essentially the same as itself. In other words, it would be essentially cloning itself, which is pretty close to the truth. All right, so know those terms. This is why you're listening to these videos, because I'm going to be telling you what's important. All right, I'm not going to ask you, this is for what I consider second semester biology for majors, so you won't have to know much about plant anatomy here. Flowers are the reproductive structures of plants. Now, we can have this term hybridization, all right? And all it means is you're breeding two plants that are different to see kind of what you're going to get. You want to know what the hybrid is. What is the cross between the two? What does the mixture look like? And when you cross them for that particular reason, then you call that hybridization. Now, cross-fertilization, this is same idea, really. It's a cross, and in other words, you cross, you mate two plants or two individuals, two flies. You could be doing flies, and those are common genetic things to those are common organisms to study genetics. When you cross-fertilize, you have the union of a female and a male gamete from different individuals. Gametes are reproductive cells. So, of course, in the case of humans, gametes are sperm and egg. In a plant, that would be pollen and an ovule. All right, same idea. I'm actually not going to go over this. I'll skip this page. I'm going to skip this one. Doesn't mean you don't need to know what's on here. Read over it, but you're not as likely to get at least intense questions about this. Now you do need to know this. So P generation stands for parent generation. So I'm going to start out breeding plants, and the first two plants I start with are going to be the P generation. The F1 are the children. The F2 are the grandchildren. All right. Know that at least. Read through. You might see the term monohybrid in there. We've already talked about true breeding, and we've also talked about self-fertilizing. So make sure you review this. Let's see, single factor cross. This is when you are looking at just one particular factor, like or character. It might call it single character cross. In this case, it's plant height, but it could be plant color, it could be in an animal, it could be eye color or fur color or something. But single factor, single trait, single character, it wouldn't be trait, it'd be character. So single character cross, single factor cross. All right, here are the actual some numbers that when you cross a purple flower and a white flower, in the case of Mendel anyhow, this is the results you would get. And notice you don't get 1 to 1, you don't get 1 to 2, it's 1 to 3.15. Now why would that be? Well, we're going to learn exactly why we get these ratios. All right, and that is it for the first set of PowerPoint.